Okay. And a very warm welcome to everybody who is joining us for this afternoon's webinar. And this afternoon's webinar is our Engage assessment webinar on Brightspace. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Bunurong Bunwurrung country in southeastern Melbourne. And I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people as traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm joining you from. And also acknowledge traditional owners of lands from which you may be joining, including the Wiradjuri, the Ngunnawal, the Gundungurra and the Biripi peoples of Australia, on whose country so many of our students, staff and community members live, work and study. My name's Mike Bryant and I'm Project Director for the Transition to Brightspace in the Division of Learning and Teaching. I'm joined today from the LMS project team by my colleague, Stephen Yates. And Stephen, I'll maybe ask you to introduce yourself. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, as Mike said, I'm fairly new to the team, and I'll be here just assisting Mike to field some of the Q&A questions. I'll also be sharing a link very shortly to the attendance form. If you could please just fill that out. It'll only take less than 30 seconds. And if we can, I'm going to try to let Mike talk through the stuff and wait for a pause to ask your questions. But if you do have questions, you can do it in two ways. You can either write them into the Q&A chat, or if you want to, if there's something like really that's standing out to you at that particular time, feel free to go off mute and just ask the question straight out. Mike will be able to answer. Most of the questions we're going to try and answer, verbally rather than typing them in. That's it from me. I'm going to share that link with you now as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for that. And just to add to what you've said, Stephen, while you share the form for just logging attendance, I've just shared in the chat the file that contains the slides from this afternoon's session. So I will be moving backwards and forwards between the slides themselves and having hands into the Brightspace platform. So please feel free to use the slides to follow through or also refer to afterwards. Thank you. Okay, with that, just in terms of where this session sits within our broader offering of training for Brightspace. So if you're involved in having responsibility for a Brightspace site, then you will have been invited to or will be invited to a session called Adapt or Create, which is about creating the site, either from scratch or from migrated content with our fabulous migration team. These engaged sessions really sit alongside those, and they are very much about how to get the most from the Brightspace platform using different focus features. And the goal of today is to look at the assessment and feedback toolset in Brightspace. A couple of resources that may be of interest and value to you. So first of all, we are progressively publishing a number of web articles. Now, the Brightspace community is very helpful, and we won't try to replicate every single piece of wisdom on the Brightspace community, and we'd very much encourage you to sign up for the community, which you're able to do as a Charles Sturt staff member. But where there are things that are specific to the university, such as setting up assignments, the correct settings to be applied for Turnitin and such like, we do provide documentation for those things. And you'll find that documentation on the Division of Learning and Teaching website using the links that are on the screen there. So do keep an eye on that site as well as we publish further guidance as we move towards our main go live. The other piece of information to mention is that we do have, as generated by our fabulous migration team, a set of what we call design principles, which are effectively basic expectations for a Brightspace site. So they can be very helpful to refer to if you want to go through the checklist and just use it as a checklist rather than just say, is my site, does my site match university expectations for an LMS site? That's a very useful destination. And again, the link is available for you in the slides. Okay, moving to the goals of today's session. So we'll be introducing, you'll be introduced to a range of Brightspace tools and processes for assessment and explore the workflows to be used for assessment within sessions at Charles Sturt. with an understanding of the tool set and also the implications of the move relative to systems that we might have had in the university previously. So that's very much our focus for today. There are all kinds of key terms, and I know a number of people that I can see on my screen who with cameras on and also on the participant list are already in Brightspace and using Brightspace, and you may have come across some of these terms. A very good example of that is the word sections. Now, Brightspace uses the word section to describe a cohort of students, and for Charles Sturt, that means a cohort like Sydney, the Sydney campus, where there's a combination of the modality students are learning in and also the location that they're learning from. So that's what we mean by a section, and that's one term that we'll be covering off today. There is a link in the slide. If you come across a term that you think has not been adequately defined, please do add it to the Menti word cloud, and then we'll get to that progressively in training. Now, for any colleagues who are yet to access Brightspace, at least recently, let me share the initial link and landing page with you. So this is how I would get into Brightspace, is just typing in that URL there that you've seen on the screen, and I'll share it also in the chat with you as well for anybody who is entirely new. Now, we are making certain assumptions in the session, and you'll see there's a nice graphic there. Assumptions don't always correspond to reality, but just so you know what we're assuming coming into the session in terms of prior experiences and the setup that might already be in place in Brightspace. So we're assuming that if you are involved in a subject site context, that the subject sites you are working with have already been checked as being fit for purpose by a subject convener or coordinator. And typically at Charles Sturt, that would happen within what we call the master subject site, which is a site that's available all the time, linked to a particular subject code that students don't see. So that's where that checking would often be occurring for us. We're also assuming that you have assessment shells available to you, such as an assignment or a quiz that's already been created ready for the session, but hasn't yet been finalized. We're assuming that where you are involved in teaching in Brightspace in the 30 session, understanding that that's not the case for everybody here, but where you are involved in teaching in the 30 session, we're assuming that students are now being enrolled into the site. And you should also be able to see where you have multiple cohorts or sections in your site. You should also be able to see those sections in the class list. And to get that, you go to your course admin and class list. We'll look at that again in a moment. Just the same as with assignments, we're assuming that if you're using discussions within your subject, as so many do, either for general question and answer or for specific topic-based discussions, we're assuming that those discussions may well already have been set up. But they're not yet active. Students are not yet posting on them. More fundamentally, we're assuming that if you need to have access to a subject site, that you do have access to a subject site. And if you don't yet need to have access to a subject site because you're not involved in 30 session or similar session teaching in Brightspace, that you do have a sandbox. Now, if you need a sandbox, you can request one very easily by creating a Cheerwell ticket within Charles Sturt. If you think you should be added to a session subject site and you're not yet, please email the team, and you can do that by emailing polaris@csu.edu.au. And usually we'd be going to the faculty or school, who are typically the people who would be responsible for enrolling you. But if you do have a problem and you feel like you should be able to access a subject site that you can't, please do let us know and the team will jump onto that and help. I think with that, I might just pause and hand to you, Stephen, to see if we've got any questions that we need to answer. Thanks.
Yeah, we do have a question. Sue is asking, subject sites are migrated to the master site, but what happens if there are multiple subject sites, all different because run by different coordinators, which is migrated to the master site for initial Brightspace setups? Quite a long question. Once we're going, this won't matter. Just this initial Brightspace master setup. I don't know if you want me to reread that, Mike.
No, thanks for the question, Sue. And the answer is that within a single session, multiple cohorts, such as Bathurst Distance and Wagga Internal, would normally be studying within the same site in Brightspace. That's different.
Yeah, that's not so my question. I was typing it and I was doing it too fast. In the initial migration to Brightspace, where you had that initial migration, which site is actually migrated to the master site in that very initial one? Like
see,
as
yes,
our,
thank you.
yeah,
Thank
so
you
it's
for-
actually the initial one because it might be run by different coordinators. They may have different things in their sites for their different cohorts, like face-to-face would be different to distance, perhaps for some subjects. So I'm just wondering which site specifically is moved to the master site in that, just that initial one, because after it's going, it won't matter because you have the same site going to all the subject sites.
Great question. Yes, and that's the nomination of the head of school. So we do ask the head of school or delegate to validate the site. We call it the kernel that is the basis for migration, as you know, what's the most suitable basis for developing the master subject. So that's that choice is made by the school.
Great, thanks. I just was thinking about it today when I was speaking to a coordinator and I was thinking, oh, I wonder what that answer is. So I'm so glad. Thank you for answering that.
No worries. Thanks so much, Steve, for the question. Great stuff. Let's jump into our content. Now, we're going to start today with the assignments tool. And an assignment in Brightspace, if you haven't used an LMS like Brightspace before, is effectively an invitation to students to submit something that's usually linked to a task or activity. So what does the assignment tool in Brightspace look like? Well, let's take a look. So I'll jump into this environment here, which should be similar to a site that you have access to, whether that's your sandbox or a different site in Brightspace. And the way that I would launch the assignment tool is by going to my assessment menu expander. And that's in the nav bar at the top of the screen. So I go to my assessment menu expander and I choose assignments. And this takes me into the Brightspace assignments tool. One special feature of Brightspace is that the tools such as discussions and assignments and quizzes are the central location for students and staff to access these tools. So normally, if you were a student, you would literally go to the assignments tool to see what assignments you had to complete. That's different to some other LMSs where the things like assignments are embedded in the main flow of the content. In Brightspace, they're always in a single location, which is the assignments tool. It doesn't mean you can't link to them from other locations. Of course you can, but this is where you would always go as a student or staff member to see what assignments were available in the site. Now, the assignments tool main page gives me several pieces of information. It tells me what assignments have already been created. And it also tells me what their status is. So if you look at the screen here, you'll see that there are two assignments that have already been created. One is called test assignment and one is called James test. Now with the test assignment example, you'll see that there is no invisible icon that appears. That means it is visible to students. Whereas for James test, you'll see that there is an invisible icon, an eye with a cross through it. That means that James test is not visible to students. That's hidden. So that's the key difference between the configuration of those two. It is really important to check that all pieces of content that you want students to be able to see are visible to them in Brightspace, because if you hide something for development purposes, it will not be visible. There are a few other icons that you see appear next to the test assignment, and the key one there is the binocular icon, which tells me that the subject coordinator or convener has set up Turnitin. Turnitin is integrated within the assignment. That's what that icon refers to, and you'll see that there's a hover over. You may see that there's a hover over there which says Turnitin enabled. So that's your central view of your assignments in the assignments tool. Now, the assignments tool is also a great starting point for marking. So in order to see how that operates, let me take you to a different site. So let's imagine that rather than right at the start of the session, I'm maybe a couple of weeks in because time will go very quickly. And so I'm now in a site that already has student submissions in. So let me choose this one and go to the assignment area where my assignment's already been deployed and students will have been submitting. Okay, so you should see here that I do have an assignment in my assignment list called Final Assignment, and it is live to students. it has already been linked to a grade item, which is something we speak to in other training. So the marks will go somewhere else within Brightspace, and it does have Turnitin enabled. So in order to mark submissions, I click on the drop-down menu to the right-hand side of the assignment name. And I'll go to View Submissions to begin with. And this will take me to two submissions that have been made in that assignment. Now, for this particular assignment type, it's like most of our assignments, it is a file submission assignment. So students have been invited to submit a file or one or more files as part of the assignment. So there's two different ways that I can view assignment submissions here. I can either view by users, or I can actually just view a list of the submissions. Most of the time for a teaching staff member, you'd be viewing a user list. If you are an academic integrity investigator, for example, you may wish to view submissions to get a list of submissions across the piece. But I'll have a look at this tab here, which tells me users. And this is a great place where I can begin to mark assignments and also to provide feedback to students. Another thing I can do via the assignment tool is I can also assign assignments to categories. So this may be particularly useful to you if you are in teaching in a subject context where you have a large number of assignments, either because there are different cohorts of students or because assignments have particular, like you have a number of assignments that all relate to the same topic, like a workplace task. And in that case, if you go to your assignment page, you'll see that you have the ability to create categories. And in this case, I've created a category called WOGA Internal, and I've got assignments here that relate to that category. Okay, the final thing that I can do in my assignments homepage, if I go back to this tab, is I can choose to mark directly from the page. So I'll go to my assignment page again, I'll go to the drop down, and I'll go to View Submissions, and that takes me straight into my marking workflow. Any questions so far, Stephen?
No, all quite quiet at this time.
Brightspace has a feature called Quick Eval, and Quick Eval is the alternate method for doing marking. The big advantage of Quick Eval is it does give you a marking dashboard, so I'll show you how that works. First of all, at subject level, so if I go back to my Romanticism assignment, I go to my subject admin, and I'll choose Quick Eval. Now, Quick Eval gives me there a dashboard of the marking that I have to do. There are three different categories of marking in Brightspace. The first one is called completed, and completed just means have the students submitted the assignment. In this case, because they are test students, there are only 3 of 10 that have submitted. The second category is called evaluated, and that means has the assignment been marked. And the third category is called published. So that's why Quick Eval is very useful, because it enables me to get an overview of where I am in the marking workflow. Now, if a mark has been published, that means that it has been released to students and pushed through to the gradebook, to Brightspace My Grades. So very often when you're marking in Brightspace, you will only be doing that in draft form. You won't be publishing the mark, because typically, in most cases, once you publish the mark, it will be released to students. So how do I do this? I simply click Evaluate All, and this will take me straight into my marking workflow, which we'll speak to in a moment, by going into the assignments tool, because that's the particular tool that I'm working in, and asking me to start doing marking. Now, in this screen, you'll see that I do have two options. One says Save Draft and one says Publish. And that's because I have a role similar to a subject coordinator in this particular site. So I do have the option, if I want to publish the mark. If you are a marker or a teaching staff member, you may well find that you don't see the publish option available to you. And that's because your subject convener or your school has decided that another member of staff should have the permissions to publish, and that the marks and feedback will be reviewed prior to publication. So that's normally how that would happen in Brightspace. Now, the big advantage of the quick eval tool is that it allows me to mark in that particular subject across all the different types of assessment that I might have. So whether they are assignments, quizzes, or discussions that are graded, you'll see them all appear here in the quick eval tool. If I spend a lot of my time marking, as I have done at a lot of points in my career, I might also be interested in how this works across a number of subjects. So as well as being able to access quick eval from my subject site, I can also access it from the main Brightspace homepage. And in order to do that, I go to the Charles Sturt University badge at the top left-hand side of the screen, and I choose in the staff nav quick eval. And the difference here now in this case, this will show me all of the marking that I have assigned to me across all of the different subjects that I might be enrolled in. And that can be a bit of a depressing list if you're in more than one subject. But if you did want to see it, that's how to do it. How are we doing for questions, Stephen? All good. Last thing to mention is that if you are in a situation of being that subject coordinator, convener, or marker who has the rights to publish, what you'll find yourself being able to do in quick eval is publish all. You'll see I go into my 3-dot expander there, and I do have an option to publish all. So once I'm at the point where I've reviewed all of the marks and the feedback, all the ones that I need to do within the moderation procedure, and I'm happy with those, I can click publish all. And at that point, normally in Brightspace, the mark and the feedback will be made available to students via a notification, and they will be pushed through to My Grades, which is the Brightspace gradebook. So that's the last element of the actual the marking workflow.
Sorry, just a quick question, if that's okay.
Please.
With the 7-day automatic extensions, we often get sort of, say, assessments coming in 2 lots. If you've, say, published all for the first lot that came in, will that then, say, automatically publish things from the second lot that came in? Or would you have to, say, publish each one individually for the first lot and then sort of publish the rest at the end?
Yes, now you can publish all is a binary. It would literally be publish all.
Yeah.
If you wanted to assign students to different groups for marking purposes, you could do that. The other thing that you can do within the individual assignment submission list is you can, I believe, bulk select. So you can select the students that you may wish to publish. So it can be a bulk action that steps short of publish all in that situation.
Yeah, I'm sort of running into this scenario fairly frequently.
Yes. So in that case, you're best going to the tool set into the assignment or quiz, looking at the user list or the submission list, and then making the selection of who to publish from that interface rather than from the quick eval dashboard.
Okay.
Great question.
Thanks.
Now, how do students submit assignments? Very important. Assuming that your assignment is visible to the students, they go into their assignment tool, and in that tool they will see the assignment links for their cohort. So they'll see literally what you've seen there, which is a list of assignments that are visible to them. They'll also see the score. So what the score means in Brightspace is the weighting of the assignment, the maximum that it is out of in terms of the overall weighting for the subject. So normally for us in our normal grading scale at the university, that would be out of 100 overall. So an assignment that's weighted 20 would be worth 20% of the overall subject, the overall subject weighting. So that should all be visible to students from their assignment tool. Assuming the assignment is open to them, when they select the assignment, they will also see a declaration text, which is our University Honour Pledge. And they will have the option to attach a file or more than one file if that's allowed in the assignment. They can input a text comment like, sorry, it's not better, or here's my assignment in the submission screen. And they can also utilize audio and video for submission at that point, should they wish to. So that's the submission point for students. At the point where they do submit, they receive a confirmation, and the similarity report will normally be available to the students. With our recommended Turnitin submission options, the similarity report would be available to students by clicking back into the assignment submission screen. They would see, as soon as the Turnitin report has been generated, they would see that report. Let's talk a little bit about Turnitin, because it's important to understand how Turnitin integrates with Brightspace. So the key message really is the similarity check in Turnitin is built into the assignment list. It's not somewhere separate. It sits within Brightspace. You may even have spotted it when we were looking at the assignments window before. So let me go back to my romanticism subject. And I go back to my assignment and I have a look at the submission list. So where is Turnitin? And the answer is it's here. So in the case of Matthew's assignment is actually placeholder text, unfortunately. So he has generated a very high similarity score for his assignment, but the similarity score does appear to you once the Turnitin report has been auto-generated in the submission list. Now, for colleagues that may have been marking in Turnitin directly previously, there's a difference here to the workflow. And the difference is this. Within Brightspace, we would be asking you to validate first that you believe the student submission is genuine. At a very basic level, that can be done by viewing the similarity score on the submission, on the Brightspace submission list. What I would personally normally do is I would have a look at the similarity report for each student. So let me show you how that works. With one click, I would be taken through to the Brightspace Feedback Studio. It's a little bit slower than it would be in our main environment, but this is what it looks like. And it's exactly the Turnitin window that you would be familiar with. It just doesn't have the option to attach feedback and a mark, but in all other respects, it's the same as what you will already have been working with. So that's how I would access the Turnitin similarity report through the Brightspace interface. But once I was comfortable the student's submission was valid, I would then proceed to do the marking within Brightspace. Marking would be done within Brightspace. Now, clearly, if I needed to, it may happen that Stephen's marking my submission, and at some point he becomes a little bit unsure whether the content is genuine. So at that point, Stephen may go back into the Feedback Studio and have another look at what I've submitted to see if it generated any Turnitin similarity matches. Now, that's always possible to do. You just go back into your submission list and click through to the Turnitin similarity report in the Feedback Studio. So that's the Turnitin similarity report and how it appears within Brightspace. Okay, so the moment we've all been waiting for, which is how do I actually use the marking interface? So at this point, let me go back to Matthew's submission, which we looked at before, and I'll click through into the marking interface in Brightspace. Okay, let me make my screen a little bit smaller. Now, the process here is effectively opening up a file submission and reviewing it for marking. And the process is also possible offline. So just as you can do in other systems, within Brightspace, you can bulk download and bulk upload file submissions that have been made as part of an assignment. Where possible, though, we would recommend to mark within Brightspace because marking autosaves. There is a log attached to the marking, so you can always retrieve the interactions that you've made. And it's also much easier to associate things like annotations that are supported within the platform. Now, the viewing window here, if I look at the assignment viewing window, this allows me to navigate a student's submission. I'll just make this sort of full screen for a while. Now, I can, if I wish to, rather than scrolling, navigate using page thumbnails. So I'll click on this menu here and I'll go to thumbnails. I can also, and this can be very useful for dissertations, navigate using an outline. So if a student has provided a chapter list or similar with their dissertation, I can use that to quickly navigate to a particular page, very similar to the Adobe functionality that you may be used to. I can view double pages if I wish to, so I simply go to the cogwheel, or I can have the page mode sit automatically. And just as you might do in an Adobe interface and a PDF interface, you can select page transition or scrolling. Okay, so what about annotations? How does Brightspace allow me to annotate a submission? So the capabilities are as follows. For text annotations, I can use either a sticky note, which is this one, or a text box, which is this one. Let's have a look at sticky notes. Now, in a sticky note, I can easily use different colors. So this particular note here, you'll see if I click on it, has been created using green, using a bright green color. So it would be possible for you to color code text annotations, perhaps link them to the learning outcomes or assessment objectives, should you wish to. I'll just close that one down and I'll press undo. Another thing I can do with annotations is I can link an annotation to a particular icon. So if I go back to my sticky notes, you'll see here I've already created a sticky note with the question icon. Let's assume that I want to create one with a tick. Here it is, and I can create it at an appropriate point in the assignment. So this does give me the opportunity for systematic annotation of students' work, if that's a valuable mechanism for giving feedback. I'll just click to undo that one. Now, a difference from other marking interfaces that you may have used is that Brightspace gives me the ability to sketch and highlight the submission. So I'll, for example, for free drawing, I'll select that one and I do have green selected and I'll just highlight the paragraph there for the student, or I can maybe underline something. I can also add shapes, so other graphical annotations are supported like line, arrow and rectangle. If I export the document, the annotated document, Brightspace will create a PDF and the sticky notes on it will be visible as PDF comments, and the annotations will also be visible in the way that they would be in a PDF graphic. Okay, so moving now to feedback capabilities more broadly within the assignment. Let me just make the annotation screen a little bit smaller, and I'll make the feedback screen a little bit bigger. So to associate overall feedback with a submission, I can include text by typing into the text editor. I can also include images, audio and video via the audio and video at the bottom. It's also possible to display equations this way and code this way in the feedback. I can also include links to other systems, like I could include a link to a Panopto video for example, and I do that using the insert stuff, just as in any other text editor within Brightspace. And that can be very helpful if I want to encourage the students to check out a particular reading or resource, for example. The real power of Brightspace feedback is in the rubric tool. And to show you this, I do need to leverage a particular rubric, which I borrowed from the Centre for Law and Justice with thanks to them. So here is an example rubric that I have attached to the assignment. And that means that the rubric will appear with the settings that I've selected. It will appear when I do the marking. So the rubric tool in Brightspace is pretty flexible and well featured. So it has the potential to save you a great deal of time on those annotations, which can otherwise be very time consuming. So this particular rubric has a snappy name of Quant Rubric Sample. I'm sure you could come up with a better one. Now this is the type of rubric that I've come to use most often in Brightspace. It's called a quantitative rubric or a points rubric. And that means it's going to calculate the score for me. I don't have to use that. I can use something called a no points rubric, but I've got drawn into using these rubrics now because they are very convenient. So as we know, Matthew has used placeholder text in their submission, so they haven't got particularly high marks on the different criteria. So in this case, I'll actually select this particular criterion level. If I want to, though, I can alter the mark within the range. I simply do this, and the mark will recalculate. Now, for the first criterion, you can see that a level description has been added to the rubric, possibly by the subject convener, which is few ethical issues identified of relevance. Sorry, Matthew, but it was just placed on the text. There is also recommended feedback to the students for that criterion level, which is already auto-populated. And if I want to, I can amend that for the student and put additional feedback in. I can also, if I want to, include some of those other things like equations, code, even video, if I want to, in that particular rubric criterion feedback.
Sorry, Mike, to interject. Beat's got a question here that relates to Turnitin. I just thought I'd ask now while you're talking about this. He's saying, so am I correct in thinking that in Brightspace, we are not marking in Turnitin itself, but Turnitin is linked to the assessment another way?
That's absolutely correct. Thanks for the question. So the integration with Turnitin means that the Turnitin similarity score appears in the Brightspace submission list, and you can click through to it at any time. But we're not asking you to complete the marking in Turnitin, and that won't be supported post the move to Brightspace. You'll actually be doing the marking in this interface, which is within Brightspace itself. But at any point, if I want to, I can go back to my submission list and I can view Matthew's similarity report should I need to do that.
And Sue also has a question around this. Can you have a 0.5 of a mark, not just whole marks, if using a rubric?
Yes, you can. Yep. So I'll go on to here and also 2.5, and Brightspace will save that for me. Now, if I wanted to, I could take the student to an external comment bank, maybe create one in a different part of the LMS and have a link here. But really, that shouldn't be needed because the comments will be, if you set up the rubric so that a comment auto-generates for a criterion level, you can then or if that has already been set up for you, you can then very quickly personalize that feedback for the students. Now, there is a row in the rubric called overall score, and we don't normally use that, and it doesn't actually influence the score that gets pushed through to my grades. It's a way that you can indicate to the student what their overall level of achievement is, such as HD, should you wish to. But that's not necessary to use, and in this case, I haven't used it at all. And the overall mark's been auto-calculated for me based on the values that I provided, and that's the mark that will be pushed through into my grades. Once I'm ready to save my mark and feedback as a draft, I do go to Save Draft here. Not yet ready to publish, but I'm ready for my subject convener to review. And at that point, I can go back to my submission list or I can go to the next user. Okay, so as before, our recommendation is when you're going through that workflow that you do use Save Draft in most instances, because normally within Brightspace, you will find that once the marks are published, they are available to students. Yeah. And just to reiterate, specific publishers can be assigned by the subject convener or coordinator if you do have a centralized moderation workflow in place within the site. How are we going with questions, Stephen?
We do have a new one. If you accidentally publish, this is a good one, can you unpublish?
Yes, you can. There's a feature called retract. So let me go back to my submission list that I was just looking at here. I'll go into Matthew's assignment. Now, Matthew is a test student, so there's no impact here to our main environment. So I will click publish. You'll see I do have the opportunity here to update should I wish to. Although students will receive a notification of any update and change. So that can be tricky if I'm doing that within a moderation workflow. But if I've simply made a mistake and the students maybe said, oh yeah, is that really right at an early stage of the marking, then it may be possible simply to update the mark. The other thing I can do as per the question is retract. And if I follow the retract button, press the retract button, that returns the assignment marking to the draft stage in the workflow. Excellent. You do have the opportunity to attach a file. That's one thing that I didn't mention before. So sometimes people like to attach feedback files, and if that's your practice, that is possible within the Brightspace interface. And finally, just a summary of what the window looks like with the annotation toolbar, the preview, the rubric that we've already looked at, the overall calculated mark, or if you're not using a calculated rubric, if you're not using a points rubric, you can simply put the mark into the box that says overall grade, and then the overall feedback editor plus save, draft, and publish. That's the way that that works. Now, we had a question previously. That was relating to special access. So this may be a great time for me to just mention that aspect of the platform about managing cohorts, because it may well be the case that in addition to being involved in the marking workflow, you're also involved in special access arrangements for students. Now, to do that, let me go to a different site where I've already got this set up and ready. So what is special access? Special access is something that allows me to override a due date or an availability condition for an assignment. And I can do this just the same way for a quiz or for a discussion that carries a mark. So here is another test subject site. And within this subject site, I do have an assignment already set up, as we saw before. Now, you'll see that we have a little key icon that appears here, which indicates that one or more students already have special access granted. So let me go into that assignment via Edit Assignment. And let's have a little bit more of a look at what that means. Now, to use the special access due date override, I go to Availability Dates and Conditions. You'll see here that this has the general availability for an assignment already populated. So in this case, the end date for the assignment's available till next year. So the students have got quite a long time to do it. And they can only see the assignments if they're enrolled in a particular section, which is Wagga distance. However, we do have 2 users who already have special access approved. So I'll click on the Manage Special Access button to have a look at their date overrides. Now, the key setting I need to be selecting here is the top one, the default one that says allow users with special access to submit outside the normal availability dates. And you'll see that Adam Webster already has an availability, a due date override, and Lisa Carey also has a due date override. So let me see if I can add another user. So to add users to due date overrides, the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what the due date will be for those users. So let's imagine that I'm going to give them quite a long extension, maybe a 2-week extension, non-standard 2-week extension, taking them to the 14th of February, 2025. Now, in order for that to work, the assignment is still going to need to be available to them. So if necessary, Brightspace will make me change the end date of the assignment for those users only to make sure that they can still see it when they come to submit. And to select the users, I can either look down my list of students, which I won't show you, or I can search for an individual student's name. I can also filter by different sections. So if I'm only interested in, say, the BATA students, then I can only look at those. Once I'm ready to select their names, I select them. And then once selected, the override I have chosen will be applied to those students. In this case, I'll just cancel here because I don't want to apply any additional conditions.
Mike, B does a question and a follow-up question as well. If you set a due date, can students still submit late?
Yes, that's an amazing question. Thank you.
And then,
so let me say a word or two more about that. But first of all, have we got another question?
Yes, Bede does have another question. Do you want me to read it out, Bede, or do you want to ask?
Okay, so just on that first question. So you'll see that in this particular assignment, which is what the question was relating to, there's actually two different kinds of date here, and this is covered in the other training that we do. First of all, there's the due date, and then there's the availability date and time. So how are those things different? The way that I think about this is that the due date is about, it's expressing an expectation to the student. It communicates an expectation. This is when we want you to submit your assignment. This is the due date. The availability date is when they can submit it. It's when they are able to. So if you wished students to be able to submit after the due date, you would make the end date of the assignment longer. It would be a later date than the due date. Now, in this case, you'll see that I do have the due date as the 31st of January, but the assignment itself is available until the 24th of February, and that's because I expect a number of students to have special access because of reasonable adjustments or special consideration requests. And so I've allowed that extra time when the assignment will be open. If the assignment is submitted late, and late means without a due date override, Brightspace will simply tell me that it's been submitted late. And then if it is policy to do this, I can apply a late penalty with the mark that I assign. So yeah.
Okay, that actually answers the second question. So there's no risk in setting a due date, just set a very late end date, and then in any event, I'll be told which students exceeded the due date. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the only circumstances in which you would set the due date and the end date the same are if you wanted to hide the assignment afterwards and not have it available to students at all after the due date. And I can do that by, so you'll see here, I've got a setting called after end hidden, but I've allowed a period of time after submission. And we would normally recommend that you set the end date of the assignment, not for the due date, but for the time when you wish to, when you plan to complete marking. And that then means the student can submit late, but you are able to apply a late penalty. Great questions. Okay. Now I'll lastly speak to the other assessment tools within the Brightspace tool set. I've spent some time focusing on the assignment tool today, but what you will find is that the quiz tool has almost identical affordances. It works in a really, really similar way. So for example, in this particular subject, I'll go back to my main subject homepage and I'll go to my assessment, expanding menu item on the navbar, and I'll go to quizzes and exams as it's currently titled. And there's a bit of a test quiz here that we've been using for people on Brightspace. But this will, just the same as the assignments, this will give me a list of all the quizzes that have been created within the site. And I'm able to see what their characteristics are. So in this case, the quiz has been linked to the gradebook and it's not yet visible. I've made it invisible. And I can go in and edit the quiz just in the same way as I would do with an assignment. And that's in order to manage the availability conditions. Where a quiz is synchronous, I can also manage accommodations with time using Brightspace if I want to. And that's more with a subject convener or coordinator role. In the case of marking, I go to grade and I can grade the quiz that way. I can also go to my quick eval, which we looked at before, going via subject admin and quick eval. And this will give me a dashboard. And in fact, I don't have any marking to do, which is a wonderful thing. And Brightspace gives me a lovely cat icon. But if I had any quizzes to mark, that's where I would go to mark them. And of course, when I say quizzes to mark, I mean quizzes where I need to assign a mark manually, as a distinction from quizzes that are auto-marked and have been designed to be auto-marked. So in essence, the quiz tool works in a very similar way to the assignment tool in Brightspace from the point of view of marking and feedback.
Mike, before we move on, Sue has 3 questions here. Will today address setting up group assignments? Does only one person submit? That's the first one.
Yeah, so to the question, I can see that, Sue, you've also asked about the submission and the feedback and the multiple marks.
Yes.
The answer is no, that's not covered in today's training. Sorry. And we are going to publish a guide on this very soon, though. Within the assignment setup, you do have the option to create an assignment that is a group assignment. In terms, I must admit, I haven't documented the different behaviors of that carefully yet, but the team will be doing that shortly, and we'll certainly be covering that both in training and also in our documentation.
I also had a couple of others just in case when you're doing the training, and that is, does everyone see the submission and has access to the feedback? So that was another one. And the third question I had was, what if someone doesn't adequately contribute? How can you apply a penalty to that person's contribution?
Yeah, we'll cover all of those things within. I mean, the broad brush answer is that Brightspace does have group submission.
Can I ask one other question? Because this one is part I haven't seen in Brightspace. I've worked with Moodle, and I used to set up for group assessments a feedback that students had to submit about their group contributions, and I would have like a bit of a table, like it was actually an inbuilt one in Moodle, and then they would have to just fill it in. And if they were all happy, it took them 5 seconds, and if they weren't, at least they got a chance to both rank themselves and their group participants. And if they didn't, well, how I had it set up, which is maybe mean, but there was a point to it. If they didn't submit, they actually got a penalty for not submitting that group feedback, which means, of course, that they were more likely to submit it and give me proper information. Because you can't apply a penalty on one person saying something about someone. It might be just a personality clash. So that's why I had that. So is that kind of mechanism in Brightspace as well?
So we won't be covering that in today's training, sorry, Sue.
No, I know you won't, but I'm just wondering if it's available or if it will be covered in the group one. I'll just attend the group one.
Definitely will be. The broad answer to your question is that Brightspace does have group submission.
That's all. Yeah, I knew it had group submission. Okay.
In terms of group member evaluation, for a more sophisticated workflow, my understanding is that the university will be piloting a tool for that in the second part of the year. So if you're interested in group member evaluations and getting involved in how we run that, please do contact DLT in due course, or there will be details provided in due course of that. There's a tool called Feedback Fruits, which will be piloted, which does have more sophisticated capabilities, if you like, for group member evaluation.
Mike, we have one more question from Bede as well. Won't Brightspace auto-mark the quizzes that were imported from Interact 2 and which were auto-marked there?
Yes, so the answer to the question, that's a great question. So Brightspace, you will find in your Brightspace site that the LMS project team has imported the quiz items that were in use, and that's as distinct from the quizzes. So if you go to your quiz tool, my expectation is that you wouldn't see a list of quizzes there, and that's deliberate because the setup of quizzes in Brightspace is different to I2, and we require academic oversight on any assessment item. We actually need academic validation that the settings in a quiz or assignment are correct in Brightspace, and that's the purpose of the training that we run with Adapt and Prepare. The question items, though, will be in the question library. So what you're likely to need to do, Bede, is to recreate a quiz that you're using with the quiz items that have been imported. Now, the vast majority of item types that are in use in Interact 2 are supported in Brightspace, but not every single item type is supported. For example, if you had a hotspot item, you may find that has not migrated successfully. So there are 1 or 2 item types that aren't supported. So that's the other reason for us to not recreate quizzes and exams directly in the new environment, because in some cases you may find that you need to rebuild a particular item type. Schools, heads of school and delegates do have full documentation about what the different quiz item types that are and are not supported, and also that's covered in our Adapt training as well. But yeah, just for clarity. So once you go through all of those steps and you recreate your quiz, auto marking can be applied at that point. but we do need academic oversight to make sure that the settings within the quiz construction are correct, because there's too much potential for error otherwise if we were to try to reproduce the intent of an Interact2 quiz.
I mean, I guess that the problem is that, you know, I myself don't know how to do that quiz setup. I mean, I just, you know, had the pools in I2, and there were, you know, 15 questions and 10 randomized questions were drawn from that. And when I'd created that test years ago, the correct answer was indicated. And then when the students took the test, it's their performance was reflected in gradebook, which I kept the columns closed. And then when everyone had finished the test, I opened the columns.
Not a problem at all. And sorry, I should have made clear, when I say we require academic oversight, I don't mean we need you to do this on your own. So Bede, when do you need those quizzes to be active for?
Well, I'm waiting for the Sydney site to be populated with students, which they said was going to happen this week, but probably only next. And the quiz will be due, should be opened to the students in end of week 2.
Not a problem. I'll ask the team to contact you, and we'll step you through the process for recreating the quiz and making sure that the settings that you apply are the correct ones.
Okay, thanks. Much appreciated.
No worries at all. Thanks for the question.
Mike, I'm just reminding you of the time. It's 2:56, just so you know.
Perfect. And we are up to time. So at this point, it's really over to me to stop sharing my screen and to say, would any participant have a question that has not yet been covered? Because we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I've got one question. When you say report a student for academic misconduct and you get that little blurb back from the academic misconduct people saying, give the student their feedback, but don't publish their mark. Is there a way to do that? Like just give them the feedback without the, whatever the current mark is?
Yes, there is, but we'll need to provide instructions for that separately. But yes, short answer, there is. You can do that in Brightspace. And thanks for the question.
Okay, thanks.
What I'd recommend for now is when you're at that stage, save as draft. You obviously get the instruction back from the academic integrity investigator. And at that point, we'll make sure that you have clear instructions about the settings to apply so that students get the feedback and not the mark.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Any other questions? Okay, so we will hang around. Stephen and I will hang around in the Zoom for a little while. So if you're curious and wants to chat a little bit more about Brightspace after the session, please do. Other than that, I'll stop the recording now. And